What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the BTR Garage. My name is Justin. In today's video, we're going to be installing a Moroso oil accumulator on my Toyota GR86. We have all of the parts and supplies, everything you need to get this installed back behind me here. Of course, we're going to go over everything we have, show you how to get it installed, and then in a couple weeks, we'll have the test results from the oil accumulator on the racetrack. Now, before we get to this installation, we did do one more test about a month or so ago back at Chuckwalla Valley Raceway. Basically, I was testing out with a full 1 quart overfill of oil, actually a little bit more. And really, the short version is that I did not see any real improvements in the oil pressure. So that test was kind of a scratch, and which led me to the next step, which is this one, which is installing the accumulator. So we'll go ahead, take a look at what we have, and then get started with the install. Let's take a quick look at all of the things that we have to install today. Of course, we have our Moroso 2.5 liter oil accumulator. This has an air pressure gauge on one side where we actually pump some air into the cylinder. It has a little plunger in here which moves back and forth based on oil pressure and essentially pushes the oil outside of the exit port, which is covered up on that side. I opted for an electronically controlled on and off valve. So that's what this is. This is a giant solenoid that will allow the system to be controlled via an on-off switch, which I will mount inside the cabin of the car. It does come with the on-off switch here, as well as the associated wiring and terminals down here. In addition to that, I also got a pressure sensitive switch. So only under certain pressure situations will the actual solenoid open up, and this is a little switch that controls that. So under 40 PSI, this switch will tell the solenoid to open up and let oil back into the engine. We also got a kit from ANSICS Auto. They provide a pretty much plug and play kit to mount this thing up to your car and get it attached. That includes this hose here. So it has the proper AN fittings, the braided line, as well as these 3D printed mounts that we'll use to mount the accumulator to the strut braces on the back of the engine bay. So a very nice kit. Makes it super easy to get everything installed. I would not go down this path without buying this kit from ANSICS Auto. They make some nice stuff. The traditional way of doing this is just using a manual valve like this one here. The Moroso accumulator actually comes with this guy. This is just a manual mechanical on and off valve. So that's off, that's on. The difference here is this one you would turn on in your engine bay before you went out on track, while as with the electronic solenoid, I can actually turn it on and off while I am on the track when oil pressure is built up. We have a few tools over here that we use to install this as well. Screwdriver, wire strippers, wrench. The strap wrench comes in handy when you need to remove or install things onto the accumulator. You wrap this around the cylinder and it allows you to keep it from turning while you're wrenching components onto the accumulator itself. Before we move to the engine bay, I'm actually going to prep the accumulator and the pieces that go on it before we mount it up. Essentially, that is the accumulator itself, the assorted fittings like this one here that attaches our solenoid to the accumulator, our solenoid itself, the pressure sensor that we talked about, and then the first AN fitting, which is the one that goes on the other side of the solenoid, which will attach our hose to. All of these fittings, we use Teflon sealing tape. And this is also where our rubber strap wrench is going to come into play here as well, if you don't have something like a vise to keep that thing from spinning when you try to tighten things onto it. With everything attached, we can do a small part of the wiring. There are 2 black wires on top of the electronic solenoid. You have to attach one of them to the pressure switch. It doesn't matter which wire you use or which terminal you use. So we're going to cut down one of these wires a little bit shorter, add one of the spade terminals on the end here, and then just attach it to the switch. Next, we're going to install the accumulator mounts from ANSICS Auto. They have these hose clamps on the bottom attached to the 3D printed piece, which is marked left or right, so you know which side to orient it on, the left side being your driver's side. What I'm gonna do to protect the surface of the bar is just put some thick Gorilla Tape over the bar itself. That'll keep from getting it scratched up. With the mounts in place, loosely attached, they're not super tight yet, we can still move them side to side. We can bring the accumulator over and slide it in between the hose clamps. So this part of the process takes a bit of trial and error to get everything lined up correctly, but the 3D printed backs of these mounts here and then the hose clamp are gonna go where this says place clamp here. So this outer ridge of the accumulator, that's where our strap goes, and the 3D printed mount. So kind of just gotta throw it in here and then start moving things around to get everything lined up okay. Drop it into place there. I already pre-fitted this once just to make the video part easier, but like I said, you're gonna have to find the right spacing between the 3D printed mounts and kind of line up the accumulator in the center of the engine bay. But once you get things pretty much in place, tighten down the hose clamps. Then we'll move over to the other side, make sure that one is adjusted at the proper width. Tighten down this hose clamp as well. Again, make sure we're not bumping up against anything. Right now I'm bumping up against a little part down here, so I want to bring the accumulator up just a little bit like that. And then in a second we'll check the hood clearance to make sure none of this stuff, the solenoid or the pressure sensor or any of the wiring, is actually interfering with the hood. So let's get this thing wrapped up and then we'll check out the rest of the fitment. So everything is snugged up. The thing is nice and solid. It isn't going anywhere, that's for sure. I added a little tiny rubber protective sleeve over that hose that was at the back of the intake manifold there. That way there is no rubbing going on there. And we're good to go to start wiring things up. I'm gonna wire everything first, and then we'll get to the plumbing parts of everything, as well as finishing off the wiring. We gotta get the wiring into the inside of the cabin for the on-off switch. One of the wiring requirements for the electric solenoid is taking this other wire and attaching it to a chassis ground. We're gonna use this bolt hole over here. I already took the bolt out. We're gonna hit that with a wire wheel or some sandpaper, as well as the bolt that came out of it as well, just to expose the raw metal. That's the same chassis ground that's actually used on the battery side, but our wire is not long enough, so we're gonna use this one over here. So ultimately that will go down onto there. We're gonna clean up those components and then attach that wire. Now we have a little bit of a test set up to make sure that the solenoid or the valve is activating when we give it power. You can see I've got a red wire coming from the pressure sensor switch right here. That goes to one end of the on-off switch right there, and then another wire that goes from the other terminal on the on-off switch over to the battery. So we have constant 12 volt power on the battery right now. Later we'll hook that up to a switched 12 volt in the car so that the solenoid only gets power when the car ignition is on. But now we can at least test and make sure this thing works. And because there's no pressure in the system right now, the pressure sensor is reading virtually no pressure, so it thinks, hey, we're low on oil pressure, we're gonna be on all the time. So when we switch this on, you can actually hear the valve click into the open state. So in an actual driving scenario on track, I'm gonna flip the switch on our outlap. At that point, the system should be pressurized. We're not gonna have a low oil pressure situation, but then when we do go into a turn where there's low oil pressure, that pressure sensor switch will detect it and then let oil out of the system, or it will open the valve, I should say, and then oil will come out of the system and get put into the engine bay. But we can shut it off here. So everything is working. We can go ahead and start finishing up the wiring now. And then the plumbing is the last thing to go, along with rerouting my oil pressure sensor, which is this guy right down here. The oil accumulator is actually gonna go down into there where my oil pressure sensor is currently tapped into, and then we'll move the oil pressure sensor down to the OEM spot, which is right down there. Throw a little light on it to make it easier to see, but basically that little white plug, that's the OEM pressure switch that tells you if you have no oil pressure, which is kind of useless for our scenario. So we're gonna put my oil pressure sensor on there. With the wire that came from the kit, I'm gonna put a little terminal on the end of the wire here to attach to the pressure sensor, just like we did on this side. And then I have a little hole down in the grommets. You can see down there, but I already have a hole in there where I have run the wiring for my GJP IO box. But if you don't have a hole, you can just pop a little hole in there and then push the wire through. We'll go to the switch, which is gonna go into a ATA fuse underneath the dashboard. We'll show you that in a minute. And then attach that in between the switch and the power source. And then that will give us the power that we need for turning on the solenoid when the car is running. I've already popped off the little plastic panel that goes down right here, right below the HVAC controls. Eventually, in a minute, I'm gonna drill a hole in this where we can mount our switch, but for now, we're gonna fish the wires up. With my wires attached on the other side of this little tool, I can just pull it through, and you probably could fish these through by hand because it's pretty easy to reach under the panel under there. But this makes it super easy because I can just pull them out like that. We'll pull all these wires through, pull the slack out, and figure out how we're gonna route them underneath the dash on the other side here. My wires are all trimmed up. I have the little terminal loops attached to them now as well. So we can go ahead and hook that up to our switch with the little bitty screws. There we go, so our wires attached to the switch. I gotta grab a screwdriver and tighten them down, obviously. So we'll take our ATA switch that we have here. We've got the cover removed to the little fuse panel. We're gonna add it to the 6-hole down on the row that is closest to the outside of the car, or basically on the left here. So you can count down 6 holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is empty by default, and we can stick the ATA switch in there, or ATA circuit, I should say. Okay, we got it in there, and this wire, we can actually test the power on this wire when we turn the ignition on using a little tester like this one here, a little light tester. Attach this other wire to a grounded spot, turn on the ignition, and we'll see if it lights up. So we'll do that real quick. All right, the ignition is on. I've attached the wire to a ground here on the door. So if we touch this, it should light up. So we've got power to that. We'll turn the ignition off. We'll test it again with the ignition off just to make sure it is in ignition only, which as you can see, there's no light coming on, so we are good. So now we can grab the wire that we have for our switch. This is the one we have routed underneath the dash here. This one will actually connect to the switch. And then coming out of the switch is this other wire here, which goes back to the solenoid or the pressure switch at the accumulator. So now with everything attached to the switch, we have our 2 wires again, like we showed, pretty basic. One wire that comes from the 12-volt power source, and then the other wire that goes out to the solenoid. So we have everything finished up in the interior other than grabbing some zip ties and tidying up the wires underneath the dash, but now we can move into the engine bay and start plumbing the oil lines. We're gonna grab the oil line that we got from the ANSYS kit, attach it to the end of the regulator here, or the valve, I should say. That's gonna kind of curve around and then go down to the oil galley port up on the top here. Obviously, I still have my oil pressure sensor attached in here, so I gotta remove this real quick first. And then there's a fitting that comes with the ANSYS kit that goes down in there that will allow us to attach the AN adapters to. And then I have to just migrate my oil pressure sensor down to the OEM spot, which we showed you earlier. We'll pop off the OEM sensor or switch down there and replace it with the actual pressure sensor. So we'll get started on that, and we should be pretty close to wrapped up at that point. The first fitting is this AN adapter that attaches to the oil galley on top of the engine block. You can see we've taken out the intake tube, pulled some of these wires aside by disconnecting them here and here. It'll allow you to get a little bit more room in there, but we basically drop this guy on to that hole. Make sure we have the crush washer in place. All right, so we got it in place there. We do need to grab a socket and tighten it down snugly. Not super tight, kind of what you would do for a oil drain plug since it is a crush washer. So I'm just gonna do like 25 foot-pounds or so, and that should be plenty. You'll need a large 15/16 size socket for that, or something equivalent in metric. This is one that I had and it fit just fine, so 15/16. Grab our hose next. The straight end is the one that goes down to the oil galley port we just installed. The fitting that has the 45 on the end, or this one here, that one goes to our valve. So we'll get this started up here. So we have it hand tightened up there for now. Kind of got to bend it around down to the AN fitting down here. Get around the wires down there. Looks like we got it going. The wires here definitely make it tight. Now we can get it snugged up with the wrench. With these AN fittings, you don't have to go super tight. Just hand snug. Put our connections back. Make sure nothing's binding too bad behind the hose, because again, like I said, it is a super tight fit. And now we can go back over to the top side and kind of angle the 45-degree fitting down where we want it. We want it to be, obviously, the hose low on the strut tower bar here. We'll probably grab some rubber to wrap around this hose and then zip tie it to the bar so it doesn't creep back up like that. With that done, now I have to actually relocate my oil pressure sensor into the OEM port, which is right here. So basically right below your oil filter housing. Just track straight under it. This little clip we can remove because it's pretty much pointless. Again, this switch just tells you if you have oil pressure or not. There's no actual pressure sensitivity to it. So we can just leave this disconnected, as we'll have a real oil pressure sensor in there. So we're gonna pop that off and then put on my other fitting for it and reattach it to my GJP IO box over here. This is where that little fitting comes in that we showed in the beginning of the video. This allows us to adapt the oil pressure sensor to the OEM oil port. It is a different thread. This is BSPT versus NPT, National Pipe Thread, I believe it is, on this side for the oil pressure sensor. So plug this guy in first, and then I'm gonna put an elbow on there so that I can use my remote sensor line that I had on there before. So the pressure sensor, for me at least, won't be directly mounted to this. My little 45-degree elbow that we'll put on there. Now you can just mount the oil pressure sensor directly into that adapter port. That's totally fine. I already have mine set up for a remote mount. And then my oil pressure sensor on the remote mount line. Feed that into there. Now the last couple steps are actually getting the accumulator ready and set up for use. The instructions that come with the accumulator say to turn the valve on, so we're gonna turn the ignition on in the car, flick the switch on, so that the valve is open. Then you have to add 60 to 100 PSI of air pressure on the fill valve on the other side of the tank. Once you have that pressure added, you have to bleed it all the way down to 6 PSI. Then we're okay to add oil to the engine. We're gonna add an additional 1.5 quarts of oil because that is a 1.5 quart accumulator. Once we have the oil added, we can go ahead and start up the car. And once the car is started, the oil pressure will naturally pump the oil into the accumulator, fill it up to 1.5 quarts roughly, and then we'll be all set for use. I'm gonna go turn the ignition on and flick the switch on the valve to get it opened up. Okay, I added roughly 75 pounds of air pressure. We'll bleed it back to 6 pounds. Okay, that looks about right. With the oil added, I just took another oil sample from the dipstick to see how much oil in there. Obviously it was way high. That's to be expected. So we're gonna back the car up. We're gonna get it started, make sure there's no leaks on anything, and then we should be able to check the oil level again in a few minutes after shutting it down. It should be back to right about where I had it before we added the extra oil, which was just about a 1/4 inch over the max fill line because we had a little bit more oil in the car before from tracking and things like that with the extra overfill. Okay, so we're ready for the first startup. I already have the ignition on because I have the data going from Race Chrono, so I can see and make sure we have oil pressure, obviously, so you can see that's working. Gas and brake, oil pressure on the upper left, so go ahead and start it up. And I'm leaving the accumulator off for this. To actually charge the accumulator, you don't have to turn the valve on. Obviously, if you had a manual valve where it is a hard shutoff, with the manual valve, you would have it open at this point, because then that way the oil could get back into the accumulator. So start her up. All right, it's building up oil pressure. So that's good. We're gonna jump over to the engine bay and check for leaks while this warms up a little bit here. So everything looks good for the most part, from what I can tell anyways, no leaks. And you'll notice I pointed to the gauge on the back of the accumulator. That's showing roughly 90-95 PSI of pressure. That's because the warm-up pressure is really high. You saw it on the data there before we stepped outside of the car. So that's indicating that we do have pressure in the system. It means oil is getting pushed back into the accumulator and filling that tank up. I'll stress again that it's important to note your oil fill level after you have the accumulator filled up with oil completely. You want to check your oil a couple times after you let it sit for a while, and then also check it again the next day after you drive the car on the street. Obviously, when I'm driving on the street, I'm not going to use the accumulator. It'll be turned off all the time, which means it's not going to pump any oil into the engine. So in those circumstances, I do want to make sure we're at the fill level of the dipstick. And when we're out at the track, we can even run it a little bit higher in 1/4 of a quart to 1/2 quart of an overfill. All right, everybody, that's gonna wrap it up for the oil accumulator installation. I hope the video was helpful. The process is pretty straightforward if you have the right tools and the right components that we showed you earlier. And obviously, like I mentioned before, we'll be heading out to the racetrack here very soon to test it out and bring the real world results to you guys. If you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, like always, leave them down below. I would love to hear from you. If you have not already, please subscribe to the channel. I would love to see you in future videos. Stick around, we got more good stuff coming up very soon. Stay safe out there. I am checking out. We'll talk to you all next time.